It is April 7th, 1945, and high above the Pacific, the largest bomber force ever sent toward Japan is flying straight into daylight. At low altitude, and with nowhere to hide, the B-29s are moments away from being torn apart by nearly 100 Japanese fighters rushing to intercept. But just before the trap closes, something impossible happens. American fighters appear over mainland Japan for the first time, and the war in the sky takes a sudden turn. People imagine intelligence as clever maps and dramatic whispers. But my days were dust and arithmetic. I counted trucks, counted barrels, counted minutes of daylight, and tried to predict where disaster would bloom next. The line gave us the usual fuel requests, curses about broken tracks, officers begging for water, men pretending they were not afraid. Then a clipped voice cut through the static, and the room went still. Rommel was speaking to his generals, and he sounded tired, not defeated, just tired of waste. He said he had watched the Americans for weeks, and 3 weeks was enough to learn Patton, and enough to die by underestimating him. He did not call Patton brilliant, he called him hungry. He said Patton punished hesitation, not with bullets, but with momentum, and momentum was the one thing you could not steal back. Then the call ended, and the silence after it felt heavier than the sandbags. I wrote every word and handed my summary to our colonel, who read it like it was a menu. He grunted, said Rommel loved drama, and said Patton was loud, not dangerous. Still, he ordered me to take a copy to the American forward post just to keep them interested. The paper in my satchel felt heavier than a rifle, because paper can start storms. The American perimeter sat behind a ridge of thorn and wire lit by lanterns that made every face look older. Inside, men argued over a map as if shouting could bend the front line. A captain with sharp cheekbones leaned over the table, moving pins with the confidence of a man who believed the world owed him good news. He looked up when I entered, and instead of dismissing me, he snatched my report and scanned it fast, then stared at me like I had carried an alive snake. He introduced himself as Captain Jack Ralston, just Jack, and he asked who had said the line about 3 weeks. When I told him it came from Rommel himself, Jack smiled, the kind of smile you see on a man who just found a shortcut through a minefield. He said Patton would love this, then laughed at his own joke like it tasted good. He offered coffee, and he asked what I thought Rommel meant, and I told him I only had notes. Jack said notes were perfect, notes did not panic. He leaned closer and said Patton was not just fighting Germans, he was fighting excuses, and excuses were the enemy that lived inside your own camp. He told me Patton could smell weakness, and he made men hate their own mistakes more than they feared the enemy. Then he added one more detail. Patton would inspect the camp at dawn, and any unit out of order would be punished, regardless of why. I tried to leave after delivering the report, but a German raid cut the road back, and the Americans insisted I stay inside their wire for the night. They said it like a favor, even as they posted a guard near my cot. Around midnight, Jack returned and said the punishment was not a shout, it was paperwork that could ruin a career. Court-martial threats, demotions, public shame, the law of a war that did not care about tired hands. He said Patton made order into a weapon, and he pointed it at pride until pride cracked. At dawn, the camp snapped awake, like a wire pulled tight. Trucks coughed, boots hit dirt mechanics, scrubbed engines like they were washing sins away. A jeep arrived, and the crowd straightened, as if the vehicle carried gravity. Patton climbed out, and the morning light flashed off polished metal on his belt and helmet, and for a second it felt like the sun was saluting him instead of the men. He walked the line slowly, letting silence do the bullying, and he stopped at a half-track with a broken radio mast. A young lieutenant began to explain sand delays, bad luck, and Patton cut him off with one question. What did you do at midnight to fix it? The lieutenant blinked, and Patton asked again, what did you do at midnight? When the lieutenant admitted he had slept, Patton nodded like a judge, hearing a confession, and told Jack to remove him from the position. Men watched like they were watching a hanging without the rope, and I felt something ugly in my stomach because I could see why Rommel feared this. Patton was teaching fear to wear a uniform. The inspection did not end with the vehicles it moved to the books. Patton called for the quartermaster, asked for ledgers, asked for signatures, asked for the lock on the storage cage to be cut. When the cage opened, the smell hit us fresh gasoline, and barrels sat hidden behind crates marked as medical supplies. Patton did not raise his voice. He just said someone had been stealing from the march, and that thief had been stealing lives. The quartermaster tried to laugh it off, but Patton ordered the area sealed, and guards posted, and he named witnesses like he was building a case. A decorated major stepped forward, a man everyone called Steady. He said Patton was making a spectacle, and spectacles were for politics, not war. Patton looked at him like he was looking at a cracked bolt, and he slid the ledger across the table. He tapped one line with a gloved finger, then another, all signed by the same hand. The major went pale, then angry, then controlled, and I realized he was not afraid of Patton. He was afraid of what Patton could prove. Jack whispered to me to keep my notes, and if I valued my skin, to keep my mouth shut. Then the major leaned close to Patton and said something I could not hear, and Patton finally smiled cold. In that smile, I saw the next escalation, not tanks, not artillery, but the law of command, turning into a public trial. If you enjoyed the tension so far, hit like and tell me in the comments who you think the thief really is, because the next thing Patton ordered made Jack stop breathing. Patton did not shout, he did not threaten, he simply told Jack to lock the fuel cage and to lock the ledger in the same safe as the radios. The camp reacted like a room that just lost oxygen because everyone understood what that meant, a sealed investigation, not a scolding. The major who had argued with him stood a little too still, like a man holding his breath underwater. I kept my eyes on the dirt and my pencil in my pocket because I could feel the shape of danger moving toward paper. Then Patton said one more order and every face turned toward me. He asked for the liaison, he asked for the man who brought the Rommel note, he asked for me by role, not by name. Jack pointed, without looking happy about it, and Patton walked over as if he was crossing a parade ground, slow, certain, and already sure of the outcome. He told me I would ride with his advance party for the day because he wanted the next report delivered straight without anyone sanding the edges. That sounded like a promotion, but it felt like a collar. When I stepped into the Jeep, the major watched me like I was a loose thread on a uniform. The road south was a ribbon of dust and ruined orchards, and Patton kept talking not to entertain but to measure men. He spoke about tempo, about forcing choices, about making the enemy answer twice as fast as he could think. Every few miles we passed, abandoned gear, boots, helmets, pieces of a life someone dropped to stay alive. Patton looked at it the way a mechanic looks at broken parts, as evidence of a system failing. He asked me what Rommel said again, and I repeated the line about 3 weeks, and Patton nodded like he had been waiting for that exact phrase. We stopped at a field command post where officers were bent over maps like gamblers over cards. Patton did not greet them like a colleague. He greeted them like a storm, walking between tables, correcting positions, asking why a unit was late, asking why a bridge was not secured. The answers were familiar shortages, sand confusion, and Patton cut them apart with a simple pattern. He asked what they did with the time they had. Men who had been loud a minute earlier suddenly sounded like schoolboys reading excuses. Jack leaned toward me and whispered that the major from the camp had already radioed ahead, and his message got there first. The message hit the command post like a bad smell. Patton listened to a captain reading it, then he looked around the tent as if he could see lies hiding behind canvas. The major claimed the fuel cage was a misunderstanding, that medical supplies were being protected, that the ledger signatures were routine. Patton did not argue. He asked for the same major to present himself by sundown with every driver and every clerk who touched that cage. The room went quiet because sundown in war is not a time, it is a deadline. Outside the tent, I saw Jack rub his jaw, and I knew he smelled a trap. On the ride back, Jack tried to act casual, but his hands kept adjusting the strap on his holster like his body was thinking for him. He said the major was not just decorated, he was connected, a man with friends in the rear who could make paperwork vanish. He said Patton was stepping on a nest that had been feeding for months, maybe longer. He told me to keep my notes safe, then he corrected himself and said, keep myself safe first. I tried to joke that my job title was liaison, not hero, and Jack gave me a look that said heroes die from titles. At sundown, the major arrived with a polished smile and a stack of neatly ordered statements. Behind him came a row of drivers, clerks, and one medic who looked like he had not slept in a week. Patton placed them under a lantern and made them speak one by one, not as a crowd, because crowds share courage. The major spoke smoothly, blaming chaos, blaming shipments, blaming enemy air raids, and Patton let him talk until the story sounded complete. Then Patton asked for the medic, and the medic admitted he had never seen those barrels used for medicine. The major did not flinch, but his eyes moved once, and that single movement landed like a confession. Patton ordered the cage opened again, and this time he brought 2 men from military police who carried sealing tape and a camera. He had the barrels rolled into the open, and he had the stenciled markings scraped clean with a knife until older markings showed through. Under the fresh paint were shipping codes not for hospitals, but for a civilian contractor, a name none of us recognized in the unit. Patton pointed at the codes like they were fingerprints. Jack muttered that the contractor name had appeared in another investigation months ago, and nobody wanted to reopen it. The major tried a different angle, the angle of righteousness. He said men were dying, that rules were luxuries, that supplies had to be moved quietly, that he was protecting the mission. Patton listened, and then asked a question without making it sound like a question. He asked why the ledger showed double requisitions on the same day. The major began to answer, then stopped, because there was no path through that. Patton turned to the military police and told them to detain the major until morning, and the lantern light made the major's face look suddenly older. The camp did not cheer, because even victory feels dangerous when it comes with cuffs. That night, I could not sleep because I knew the major had friends, and friends in a war zone do not send flowers. I heard boots outside my tent, slow, careful, the kind of steps a man makes when he does not want to wake witnesses. I held my breath and listened, and the steps paused near my canvas wall. A shadow moved across the lantern glow, and a hand brushed the tent rope, not tugging, just testing. Then the shadow left, and I realized I had been measured the way a lock is measured before a break-in. In the morning, the major was gone, not escaped in a blaze, not dragged away by a rescue team, just gone as if the ground opened and swallowed him. The military police swore he never left their sight, and the sentry swore he never saw a prisoner moved. Patton did not explode. He simply asked for the logbook, then asked for the radio operator, then asked for the list of vehicles that rolled after midnight. Jack looked sick because the only way a prisoner disappears is if a system cooperates. Patton stared at the empty holding area and said someone inside the unit had just declared war on the investigation. The next order was sharper than any shell I had heard that week. Patton told Jack to halt the entire column movement for 1 hour, and in war an hour is a fortune, but he did it anyway. He told the provost to block the road, to check every truck, to open every canvas cover, and to pull every driver off the wheel until their hands were visible. Men began to mutter because delays kill, and Patton knew it, which meant this was not a gamble, it was a necessity. I watched the line of trucks stop like a frozen river, and I saw faces turn toward me again because my Rommel note had started this chain. I tried to stay small, but the world does not let you hide when it needs a scapegoat. A sergeant walked by and said in a friendly voice that the enemy was lucky to have spies who carried messages for free. Another man laughed the laugh of someone who wanted company for his fear. Jack stepped between them and told them to focus on the search, but the seed had been planted, and seeds grow fast in stressed soil. If you think you know who will be blamed first, drop it in the comments and hit like, because the next truck they opened carried something far worse than stolen fuel. The truck they stopped was not the oldest, not the dirtiest, not the one that drew suspicion by looking wrong. It was clean, freshly tarped, and driven by a corporal everyone trusted because he smiled easily and never complained. When the canvas came off, there were crates stacked tight, stenciled with neat numbers that matched the manifest perfectly. Jack almost waved it through, and Patton almost let him, and that almost would have ended the whole thing. Then Patton asked the corporal one question: "Where did you load this?" The corporal answered fast, too fast, naming a depot that had burned 2 weeks earlier. Patton did not accuse him. He asked the crates to be opened. Inside were radio parts, spare tubes, coils, and sealed boxes marked with calibration tags. It looked harmless until Patton lifted one box and felt the weight. He nodded to Jack, and Jack pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside were gold coins wrapped in cloth. Not a fortune, but enough to explain motive. The corporal went pale, then angry, then he ran. He made it 3 steps before a rifle butt put him in the dirt. No cheers, no speeches, just the sound of breath leaving a man who knew his luck had ended. Patton ordered the corporal held, then he ordered the rest of the crates checked. More coins appeared hidden in false bottoms, and the pattern became clear. Fuel stolen to sell radios diverted to traders, gold moving backward along the road, like blood returning to a heart. Jack whispered that this was bigger than a major, bigger than a camp, and Patton heard him and agreed without nodding. He said, "Corruption loved scale, and scale loved silence, and silence died today." He told the provost to radio rear headquarters and request an audit team, and when the provost hesitated, Patton said, "Now." The column moved again, slower, heavier, as if every wheel carried guilt. I rode with Jack, and he told me the corporal had family in the rear, a cousin with a desk and a stamp, the kind of man who could bury a file under polite phrases. Jack said that if this reached the wrong ears, first Patton would be framed as reckless, disruptive, a man who endangered the advance for pride. I asked why Patton kept pushing then, and Jack said, Patton believed momentum was moral, and rot slowed armies the way rust slowed engines. He said Patton would rather fight his own than lose to rot. We reached a supply hub where tents sprawled like a small city, and Patton ordered a freeze on outgoing shipments. That caused panic, not quiet panic. Loud panic officers, demanding exceptions, quartermasters shouting about schedules, drivers pleading to move before daylight. Patton stood on a crate and spoke plainly, saying the freeze would last 1 hour, and anyone who broke it would answer to him personally. The hours stretched like a wire pulled tight, and I felt eyes on my back because messengers are blamed when messages hurt. During the freeze, Patton walked the hub with a notebook, stopping at random tents, asking simple questions. Who signed this? Who delivered that? When did this arrive? He was not looking for perfect answers, he was looking for hesitation. He found it in a clerk who could not remember a date, then found it again in a driver who remembered too much. Each time, Patton marked a line and moved on, letting fear do the sorting. Jack said it was cruel, and Patton said cruelty was letting thieves starve soldiers. Halfway through the hour, a jeep arrived from the rear, with a colonel wearing a smile like a shield. The colonel greeted Patton loudly, joked about dust and heat, then asked privately if the freeze could be lifted for a special shipment. Patton asked what made it special, and the colonel said high priority, then said confidential, then said political. Patton wrote the word political in his notebook and closed it. He told the colonel the freeze stood, and the colonel smiled thinner, then warned that phones would ring. Patton said, let them ring because phones carried voices, and voices carried mistakes. The hour ended, and Patton lifted the freeze, but he did not restore trust. He ordered a new routing plan, splitting shipments across different roads, different times, different drivers. He said thieves loved predictability, and unpredictability was free. Jack said the drivers would hate it, and Patton said hatred was lighter than coffins. As the hub settled, a runner brought a message. The audit team was delayed, weather confusion excuses. Patton folded the paper and said the audit would come from the front instead. That night, the corporal tried to talk. He offered names, routes, a map scratched into the dirt with a stick. He said the major had been a gatekeeper, not a mastermind, and the real buyers waited beyond the horizon, men with clean hands and dirty money. Patton listened, then asked one question, where is the major? The corporal laughed a short bark and said the major never slept in the holding area. He said the major had a room in the rear with a phone that worked even when radios did not. Jack swore under his breath because that meant the disappearance was not magic, it was permission. Patton ordered a patrol to the rear room, and when they returned, the room was empty, papers burned, phone smashed, and a single receipt left behind charred at the edges. The receipt showed a date and a time midnight, and a signature that matched the ledger. Patton held it like a relic and said the major did not run, he was extracted. Extraction meant protection, and protection meant the enemy wore friendly faces. I realized then that my Rommel note was a spark, but this was a fire that had been waiting for oxygen. Jack told me to write everything but to write it twice, once for truth and once for survival. He said, choose which copy you carry based on who asks for it. I asked him which copy he carried, and he said the one he could live with. Before dawn, a shot cracked, the quiet not close, but close enough to wake guilt. A sentry had been found unconscious, the holding area empty again, and the corporal gone. No blood, no struggle, just absence. Patton stood in the gray light and said, we had crossed a line because thieves now feared exposure more than death. He ordered the column to move, because stopping longer would feed panic, but he also ordered Jack to assemble a small team for a task that did not exist on any map. Jack looked at me, and in that look, I saw the next escalation, quiet, legal, and deadly to reputations. If you think this is where the investigation dies, hit like and prove it wrong, and tell me in the comments whether you would trust a general who fights his own supply chain in the middle of a war. Because the mission Jack outlined next would turn paperwork into a battlefield. Jack assembled the team before sunrise, not in a tent but beside a line of trucks where engines ticked as they cooled. He chose people who did not look impressive, a clerk who knew serial numbers by heart, a driver who could smell bad fuel, a radio man who fixed sets by listening instead of measuring. He chose me because I carried paper without pride. Patton did not attend, which told me this work needed distance, the kind that protected him if it failed and buried others if it succeeded. Jack said, we were not hunting men, we were hunting patterns, and patterns hated light. We started with the ledgers, not the clean ones, the ugly ones with coffee rings and torn corners. The clerk spread them on a crate and traced dates with his finger, showing gaps where trucks should have passed but did not. He showed duplicates, where one signature appeared twice on different roads at the same hour. The driver nodded and said that was impossible unless the clock was wrong or the paper lied. Jack said paper always lied first because men taught it how. We marked routes that bent like a snake and times that overlapped like shadows. By midday, we found the seam a weekly window when shipments slowed for no reason that weather could explain. During that window, radios went quiet, not dead, just quiet enough to miss calls. The radio man smiled without humor and said that meant someone knew which switch to touch. Jack said good, because switches left fingerprints of habit. He sent the radio man to test sets along the route one by one, logging which frequencies faded first. I wrote until my hand cramped because details were the only currency we had. That afternoon, a captain arrived with authority and questions. He said he had been sent to help, which meant he had been sent to watch. Jack welcomed him, gave him coffee, and asked him to sign for a packet that did not exist. The captain hesitated, then laughed, then refused. Jack apologized and said it was a mistake. When the captain left, Jack said the refusal mattered more than a signature because it showed fear of ink. Fear of ink meant fear of trace. We set a trap that evening, not with soldiers, but with paperwork. Jack altered a manifest by one line, moving a shipment by an hour and a mile. It was small enough to look like an error, big enough to disrupt a thief's plan. We waited. At dusk, a truck arrived early, its driver angry, saying he had been told to hurry. Jack asked who told him, and the driver named a sergeant who was not on duty. The sergeant appeared moments later, breathless, explaining confusion. Jack wrote his name twice. Night fell, and with it came the whisper campaign. Men asked why shipments were changing, why radios were tested, why officers walked with notebooks. Someone said Patton had lost his mind. Someone else said intelligence was spying on its own. I felt the chill of being watched because messengers are visible even when they carry nothing. Jack told me to keep my head down and my ears open. He said rumors were confessions with courage removed. At midnight, we heard the engines. 3 trucks rolled without lights, guided by moon and familiarity. They did not stop at the hub. They turned onto a farm road that was not on any official map. Jack smiled thin and tired and told us to follow at distance. We did, the driver easing the throttle, the radio man listening to static breathe. The road ended at a stone building with a locked gate and no guard, which told us everything. Jack ordered the gate opened, legal authority, folded in his pocket like a knife. Inside the building were crates stacked too neatly for chance. The clerk checked numbers and shook his head because these were tomorrow's radios, not today's. Jack ordered them opened. Inside were the parts again, and beneath them, fuel coupons stamped with dates that had not happened yet. The system was feeding itself forward, stealing tomorrow to pay yesterday. Jack said that meant planners were involved, not just thieves. A figure ran, and the driver tackled him hard. The man cried that he was only moving boxes, that orders came from above. Jack asked how far above, and the man pointed upward without meaning it. We found a desk upstairs with a phone wired directly to the rear, not through the hub. The radio man laughed once sharp and said that was the switch. Jack cut the wire and put it in his pocket like a snake with its head off. Before dawn, a message arrived, ordering us back. The tone was polite, the words careful. It said jurisdiction, it said coordination, it said delay. Jack read it twice and said we had touched the ceiling. He told me to make copies of everything, then burn half. He said truth needed redundancy, but survival needed scarcity. I asked which half to burn, and he said the half with names. As we drove back, Patton's Jeep passed us going the other way. He did not stop, he did not wave. He nodded once, and that was permission and warning in equal measure. Jack said the next move would not be ours, because the system would counterattack to prove it still owned the board. He said watch for legal language because that was how knives wore gloves. That afternoon, the counterattack came. Orders froze our access, reassigned our team, and praised our initiative while removing our authority. Men we had spoken to avoided us. The captain from earlier smiled again, wider now. Jack did not argue. He packed the ledgers and said the trap had sprung, just not on the rats. He said we had forced the system to show its hand, and hands could be read. As the sun set, Jack told me to prepare a report that did not accuse, that only described, that let numbers speak until they screamed. He said Patton would need it when the time was right because timing was a weapon. I asked when that would be, and Jack said, when they tried to bury us with law. He said, then we would answer with law of our own. If you think the law always protects the powerful hit, and tell me why. Because the hearing scheduled next would turn paper into a blade, and someone was about to bleed without a single shot fired. The hearing was announced as a review, not an investigation, which told me everything about its intent. Reviews tidy desks, investigations overturn them. Jack said we would attend anyway because absence is a confession the other side writes for you. We entered a room that smelled of polish and patience, men seated behind a table that reflected faces back at themselves. I took notes because that was my shield and because silence listens better when your hands are busy. They opened with praise, the kind that makes a cage feel like a compliment. They thanked us for initiative, for adaptability, for enthusiasm under pressure. Then they asked why we had exceeded scope, why we had disrupted supply flow, why morale had dipped in units that relied on predictability. Jack answered without heat, describing dates, quantities, delays measured in minutes, not feelings. He spoke as if he were reading weather, not accusing storms of malice. The first twist arrived disguised as procedure. A colonel produced a memo dated 2 weeks earlier, authorizing a pilot program that mirrored our findings and claimed ownership of the discovery. The room hummed with approval. Jack nodded and asked to see the annex. There was none. The colonel said it had been lost. Jack said, then the memo described a ghost, and ghosts could not sign for radios that existed tomorrow. I felt the air shift thin as paper tearing. They pivoted to witnesses. The sergeant we had written twice was brought in pale and precise. He spoke of confusion of orders, misheard of pressure from schedules. He denied the phone, denied the gate, denied knowing the farm road. Jack asked him to draw the route from memory. The man drew it perfectly, including the bend where the moon hides. Jack thanked him and asked the clerk to show the duplicate signatures. The man stared at the table, and the room went quiet. Then came the legal glove. A civilian advisor stood and said evidence gathered without proper authorization was inadmissible. He spoke slowly, savoring the rhythm of protection. Jack did not argue. He asked whether the advisor agreed that supply loss harmed operations. The advisor said yes. Jack asked whether remedy required understanding cause. The advisor said yes. Jack asked whether cause could be understood without examining records. The advisor paused. Silence does work if you let it. The off-script twist landed hard. A messenger arrived with orders redirecting Patton's fuel allocation, citing efficiency concerns. It was retaliation with numbers. Jack smiled like a man who sees a trap reset. He requested a recess and walked to the window. I followed because gravity pulled me there. He said this was the outside twist, the one meant to scare us into folding. He said instead it proved motive, because only someone touched would flail so openly. We returned and Jack asked permission to read from a log, not ours, but a unit's daily maintenance record. It listed radios failing in sequence along the same route during the same window. He asked the radio man to explain failure patterns without jargon. The radio man spoke of switches and habits, and hands that touched the same place every time. He said machines forget, men repeat. The advisor objected. The chair overruled softly. The captain who had smiled earlier requested to speak. He offered to take responsibility to protect the institution. He framed himself as a buffer, a necessary sin. Jack asked him where the coupons came from. The captain said from above. Jack asked how far. The captain said far enough. Jack placed the cut wire on the table. The captain stopped smiling. The collapse did not happen with shouting. It happened with accounting. Jack asked for an audit limited to 1 week, 1 route, 1 office. The chair agreed, because limits feel safe. The audit returned before sunset. Numbers do not lie when you ask them small questions. They showed tomorrow stolen to pay yesterday, showed signatures clustered like bruises, showed approvals stamped at hours when offices slept. The chair closed his folder. Outside rumors bloomed. Some said we had gone too far, others said not far enough. Patton arrived after dark, not in uniform with dust on his boots. He read the report standing. He asked Jack one question, whether the remedy would slow the advance. Jack said no, it would speed it by removing drag. Patton nodded and said, then proceed. The final twist of the chapter was mercy. Patton ordered arrests quietly and reassigned men without spectacle. He let the institution breathe while removing the rot. He told Jack that fear was useful only until it made liars bold. He told me to keep writing because history forgets clean endings if no one dirties paper. As we left, the captain passed us, escorted. He looked smaller, like a man who had been living in a borrowed coat. He did not curse us. He asked whether it was worth it. Jack said, ask the men who get radios that work tomorrow. The captain nodded once, and the door closed. If you think justice only comes loud, comment. Why? Because the quiet orders that followed would reshape the board overnight, and the next morning, the trucks would roll on time for the first time in weeks. The morning after the arrests felt wrong, like the air had learned a new rule and had not told the lungs yet. Trucks rolled on time, radios spoke clearly, and men avoided eye contact because calm after disruption makes everyone suspicious. Jack said this was the dangerous hour, the one where victory relaxes the spine and invites the counterpunch. He told me to watch for gratitude, because gratitude is how enemies ask you to sleep. By noon, the gratitude arrived wearing urgency. A directive praised corrective action and announced a consolidation, folding our work into a broader effort under a new committee. Committees are how momentum is diluted. Jack read it, folded it once, and said the timing was off. He asked me to list who benefited from the delay. I wrote names without adjectives. The list was shorter than I feared, which meant the strike would be sharper. The counterpunch came through law again, cleaner this time. A review of Patton's fuel usage questioned efficiency and suggested redistribution. It cited doctrine and fairness. Jack said, "Fairness without context is a blade that cuts the wrong hand." He asked for the logs from the night routes, the ones that proved flow. They arrived redacted. Jack smiled because redaction admits fear of light. Patton summoned us in the late afternoon. He stood over a map and tapped the routes with a knuckle. He asked what we needed to finish it. Jack said authority for 48 hours in silence. Patton gave him both and added a warning that pressure would spike at hour 36. He said when they run out of arguments, they invent emergencies. He said do not answer the emergency they name, answer the one they hide. We used the time to stage a public test without calling it public. Jack ordered a convoy through the previously dead window and invited observers under the banner of training. He let skeptics attend. He let them count trucks. The radios sang. Nothing failed. Success is the loudest witness when it shows up on schedule. At hour 30, a call arrived, reporting a breakdown on a parallel route asking for diversion. Jack refused politely and documented the refusal. He sent a mechanic to the reported breakdown anyway. The mechanic found a loose fitting tightened by habit, not accident. He took a photograph and wrote the time. Jack added it to the file and said habits return when watched. The high point of the chapter was not dramatic, it was arithmetic. Jack presented Patton with a single page that showed minutes saved per truck, multiplied by days multiplied by divisions. It equaled battalions. Patton looked at the number and said, "Then we will move like water." He ordered the committee dissolved and named accountability without names. He said results have parents, even when children deny them. The outside twist struck at dusk. A civilian suit arrived with an injunction paper heavy with words meant to stall movement. Jack read it and asked one question, whether the injunction covered training convoys. The suit said no. Jack said, "Then we are training." The suit objected. Jack nodded and asked him to sign receipt of notice that training would proceed. The suit hesitated, then signed. Ink matters. Pressure climbed. Phones rang. A message warned of consequences. Jack told me to keep the lights on and the doors open. He said secrecy feeds rumor, openness starves it. We posted schedules on boards. We invited questions and answered with dates. Men relaxed because clarity is a sedative. At 95% of the chapter, the climax arrived without noise. The injunction was lifted, the appeal withdrawn, the fuel flowed uninterrupted through the window that had been stolen. The system exhaled. Patton moved units that night quietly, decisively. No parade marked it, only dust. After midnight, Jack sat with me and said the real win was not the arrests or the orders. It was teaching the machine to prefer daylight. He said machines learn from pain once men learn from habit forever. He asked me to write a final note that framed the outcome as inevitability, not triumph. He said pride invites revenge. As dawn came, trucks crossed the horizon like a sentence completed. If you think the loudest victories are the ones worth telling, comment. Why? Because the quiet movement at first light would change the map before anyone finished arguing about it. The last night before the push was colder than it had any right to be, a thin, clean cold that sharpens memory. I walked the line and felt the machine hum the way a living thing hums when it finally trusts its own breath. Trucks idled, maps lay flat, men spoke softly. Jack said this was the sound of a system choosing itself. He told me to remember it because later people would try to rename it luck. The final test came disguised as reconciliation. A senior officer arrived with a smile and a handshake and an offer to bury the past for unity. Unity is a word that can mean forgiveness or erasure. Jack listened and asked one question about dates. The officer answered loosely. Jack thanked him and declined. After he left, Jack said dates are anchors. Anyone who floats them is hiding a tide. Patton returned at dawn. He did not shout. He did not pace. He looked at the routes and nodded once. He told us the movement would begin under weather that favored audacity. He said speed would be our shield. He said, if the enemy sees only dust, they will imagine thunder and hesitate. He placed his finger where the map narrowed and said, this is where they think we slow. We will not. As the first columns rolled, the pressure tried one last time to find a seam. A message arrived, warning of an investigation after the fact. Jack smiled and said after the fact is where history lives. He told me to keep the logs clean and the doors open. He said, sunlight turns threats into receipts. The movement unfolded with the grace of repetition. Each unit entered the window on time and exited earlier than expected. Radios stayed calm, fuel flowed, the arithmetic held. Men who had learned to distrust the clock learned again how to trust it. I watched faces change as certainty returned shoulders, lowering jokes creeping back. Morale is logistics with a pulse. At the edge of the day, news came from the front that the enemy was wrong-footed. Recon reported confusion, misread intent, delayed reaction. Patton did not celebrate. He said, "Confusion is a resource. Spend it quickly." He ordered the next phase without flourish. The machine responded. The reckoning for the antagonists did not arrive with sirens. It arrived with reassignment and silence. Files closed themselves when exposed to air. Careers bent under the weight of their own signatures. No one was paraded. Jack said parades create martyrs. He preferred footnotes. That evening, a junior clerk approached me with a question about courage. He asked how to know when to push and when to hold. I told him what Jack told me. Push when the facts align and the risk is honest. Hold when the noise is loud and the truth is quiet. He nodded as if writing it somewhere private. Patton called us in once more, not to praise, but to caution. He said the next enemy would be comfort. He said success makes men forget the small thefts that precede big losses. He said build habits that punish convenience. He dismissed us with a look that meant the work would continue without our names attached. Later, Jack and I sat with coffee gone thin and cold. He asked what I would write. I said I would write about daylight and arithmetic, and doors left open. He said good because stories that focus on heroes teach the wrong lesson. He said the lesson was process defended with spine. As night settled, the road stayed busy, steady as a metronome. I felt the strange peace that follows a storm when you know the roof held. The machine kept moving because it had learned a preference. It preferred truth to theater. It preferred speed to pride. It preferred daylight. Before sleep, I thought about Rommel and the warning he gave and the weeks it took for men to listen. I thought about how warnings age into prophecy when ignored. I wondered which warnings we were ignoring now, which habits would save us later. If you think victories are moments instead of systems, tell me why. Because the road kept moving into the dark, and somewhere ahead, another lesson was waiting to see if we would listen this time.